Investigators find Comey was insubordinate in breaking the rules during the Hillary Clinton email probe, and a devastating text from a rogue FBI agent saying, quote, "We'll stop Donald Trump's election."
James Comey launched the greatest October surprise in the history of American politics, and it ripped to shreds Hillary Clinton's campaign.
The bias, and there was a lot of it, was against Donald Trump and his campaign. And there's an enormous amount of that on display in this report.
So here's the irony. The actions of the so-called deep state, this unfounded conspiracy against the president that is touted by the White House in a number of different ways, actually seems to have worked in favor of the president.
There really was a scheme to protect Hillary Rodham Clinton from being indicted and smear and slander then candidate, then president-elect Donald Trump, and now president at all costs.
But the IG report also finds Comey wasn't influenced by political bias. We'll look at the spin war. Trump rips the coverage of the Singapore summit and says so-called fake news is our country's biggest enemy. Yes, he said that after meeting with Kim Jong-un, as liberal commentators denigrate his diplomacy.
These are awful people, and he wants to become best friends with them.
I found it rambling. I found it at times incoherent. I found it giving away more than having got.
We have never seen a more naive and trusting American president in a summit meeting with a foreign leader of any country in history.
The elites on the left want this president to fail. To hell with nuclear war. If you have to have a nuclear war to get Trump to fail, then I think half of them are okay with that. I'm not exaggerating.
Does the coverage betray a double standard, or are journalists just underscoring the vagueness of the agreement with North Korea? The president punches back at Robert De Niro, who dropped the F-bomb on him at the Tonys. Is there any limit to Hollywood's hatred for Donald Trump? Plus, my debate with actor and activist Rob Reiner. After the election, you call the outcome the greatest attack on this democracy since 1941.
I think I not only agree with that, but I would go even further.
About his angry rhetoric toward the president and his criticism of the press, especially Fox News. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The Justice Department's Inspector General ripped James Comey in that report, finding that the former FBI chief flouted all kinds of rules in the Hillary Clinton investigation, but not motivated by political bias. And the report uncovered new texts between those two rogue FBI agents having an affair, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. Page says Trump is not ever going to become president, right? Right. Strzok? No, he won't. We'll stop it. President held forth for nearly an hour Friday, first with Fox's Steve Doocy, and then when surrounded by a scrum of shouting reporters.
You go into the FBI and take a poll of the real FBI, not the scum on top, not Comey and that group of people that are total thieves.
From what you've seen so far, should James Comey be locked up?
Well, look, I would never want to get involved in that. Certainly, they just seem like very criminal acts to me. I think that the report yesterday, maybe more importantly than anything, it totally exonerates me. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Sarah Fisher, a media reporter at Axios. And Marie Harf, Fox News analyst and former spokeswoman for the Obama administration. Molly, that scrum, the press on the White House lawn, looked like an out-of-control kindergarten that needed a timeout. But as most of the press has acknowledged, this Inspector General's report put a serious stain on Jim Comey's reputation. At the same time, press saying, oh, the president was wrong when he said he was totally vindicated because the report didn't examine whether there was collusion or obstruction with Russia.
Yeah, this is a really good time for people to actually read the report before they talk about it. And it is true that this was focused really on the Hillary Clinton email probe, although there was a lot because the same people covered the Hillary Clinton email, or the same people investigated the Hillary Clinton email probe as investigated the Donald Trump probe. There is a ton of overlap. And throughout this report, you have people openly talking about just breathtaking bias that they have in favor of Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump and promising that they will prevent him from getting elected. At the same time, they're ramping up this investigation of him. So that is exonerating of Donald Trump. It's not fully an exoneration, but it's one of his main arguments is that the Department of Justice and FBI have had widespread problems with bad decision-making, bias, and other problems that affect the investigation into him.
At the same time, Marie, I mean, Jim Comey was a media hero, at least until his book tour. And so I think pro-Hillary commentators must be happy that the IG slapped him down and revealed that he sat on those last-minute charges, the Anthony Weiner laptop and the emails, for more than a month before popping it, in the final days of the election. So your reaction to that?
Well, I think there's something for everyone in this IG report. Molly's right. People should read it. A bunch of things are true. These FBI officials do have text messages that look terrible. They give the impression of bias. The IG report also found no evidence that those political leanings impacted the investigation. Jim Comey, I think, comes across very badly as a Democrat reading what he did, which did hurt Hillary Clinton politically, even if that wasn't his intention. Reading his sanctimonious decision-making processes is very hard for me. So I think sort of how you look at the IG report for the opinion commentators is based on where you sit politically in many ways. But the president said a number of things about the report that are not accurate, and it's on the media to call those falsehoods out when he does that.
And speaking of the media, they also had a cameo in this report, Sarah. The IG said couldn't even dig into all the leaks because there were so many of them. Dozens of FBI staffers having contact with journalists, and including they flouted ethic rules, this is according to the report, by accepting sports tickets from journalists, by playing golf with journalists, accepting meals and drinks, and going to private social events.
I mean, it's incredibly contentious. If you're at the FBI, you're obviously not supposed to be doing those things. What does it mean for the media? Are they supposed to be funding these sporting events and funding meals? I mean, Short answer, no, they're not. I mean, it almost seems like something close to bribery. I mean, in the media, you are given some budgets to take out sources. Maybe it's going to be a coffee or a lunch, but it is unprecedented to hear about some of these events, golfing, sporting outings. I mean, I'm a reporter. I've never taken a source out golfing.
Right.
Why haven't I been taking golf?
There's another issue here, too. The Justice Department recently went after a congressional aide and a reporter because they care enough about leaks, apparently, over there when they have their own huge problem right underneath their nose, and they're not doing anything about it.
Right.
That's one of the things the IG said, is that it's such a big problem, nobody knows what to do. Well, you know what? They should be doing that well before they go after reporters and congressional aides.
Absolutely.
This is a former Senate intel aide has been indicted, and the reporter who now works for the New York Times. So this is all unfolding as Paul Manafort was taken to jail, waiting trial because of witness tampering. But let's come back to these incriminating tests. Peter Strzok, Lisa Page. We've seen lots of really biased texting before. We hadn't seen this one. I guess it was somehow held back. But I think it's made a lot of headlines because it's just so over the top, whether or not they were actually able to carry that out. I mean, these people hated Donald Trump.
Yeah, and first of all, I do want to make one point that the IG specifically said that they couldn't determine that waiting to handle that Weiner laptop was a decision free from bias. They basically strongly suggested that Peter Strzok was so biased that he made a bad decision on trying to pretend that those emails hadn't been found on Weiner's laptop and instead focusing on the Russia investigation. It's also true that these weren't just about Peter Strzok and Lisa Page texting their extreme bias. It was 5 different people involved in this probe that were texting really extreme things, insults against people who voted for Trump, expletives against Trump. One attorney said "Viva la resistance." The attorney who was actually asking Hillary Clinton questions during that interview she had said, "I'm with her," when he did that. So again, it's not necessarily The IG is careful to say there's not hard evidence that he said, "I'm with her, therefore I'm letting her get off." Right. But I think reasonable people can say this level of bias is very problematic for 2 very politically sensitive investigations.
Well, it's no then surprise, Marie, that journalists and pundits are cherry-picking the evidence because, as you say, there's something here for all sides. Right. I think the only common denominator is that Jim Comey had very flawed decision-making. And was doing things like holding press conferences about non-indictments that he shouldn't have been doing.
Right.
So that enables each side to say, well, here's evidence that supports our contention.
Right. This is the system we live in right now in terms of partisanship. But what Jim Comey did was end up hurting Hillary in July and in October, even if that wasn't his intention.
Well, wait, the other side would say he didn't hurt Hillary because he didn't bring charges against her, although he did hold a press conference and sort of trashed her.
And trashed her, which the IG says was not good practice. What's interesting is law enforcement and the FBI have historically been much more conservative. Now, they are nonpartisan, but they've traditionally been much more conservative, if not Republican-leaning. So, yes, these text messages look terrible, but we have to rely on the IG's determination that they did not find any hard evidence that this bias impacted the investigation.
Because as I just pointed out, there was that example where they said that they did believe that bias had affected that decision.
Well,
and overall,
no, they did not say that they believed bias impacted it. They cannot determine why they waited so long to look at the Anthony Weiner laptop, which again had the effect of hurting Hillary.
Here we are, still talking about the Anthony Weiner laptop. One more point on this, Sarah, and that is minutes after this report was made public, New York Times published online an op-ed by James Comey that was obviously ready to go. It strikes me as pretty close to collusion.
I mean, if you take a look at this, it was really minutes after. There were social cards ready on Twitter with quotes from James Comey. So it gives off the appearance that the New York Times was sort of willing to take James Comey's op-ed and publicize it, et cetera. You had people on the right, including Sean Spicer, asking, would they have done this for a Republican? It also takes into consideration, what's James Comey's media strategy here? I mean, he could have just put out a statement. But going to the New York Times with an op-ed, a paper that's so intertwined with a lot of these investigations.
And his own leaks earlier.
That's right.
Yeah.
Is a little bit of a questionable choice.
I want to get to this, and that is, you know, we're going to talk next segment more about this. So the president comes back from North Korea and he puts up this tweet, really harsh words to the media. Let's put it on the screen. So funny to watch the fake news, especially NBC and CNN. They are fighting hard to downplay the deal with North Korea. 500 days ago, they would have begged for this deal. Looked like war would break out. Our country's biggest enemy is the fake news so easily promulgated by fools. So when he says biggest enemy, I have a problem with that. I think it's beneath the president. It's fine for him to attack what he thinks is unfair coverage. I'd like to get everybody in on this.
And to be clear, he does say that fake news is an enemy, and I think everyone on left and right agrees that fake news is a problem. And just speaking on
But that's his shorthand for major news organizations.
Well, but we do need to make sure that we are telling accurate news. We'll talk about North Korea in a minute. But even on this IG report, you know, we've had two major storylines that have been pushed for much of the last year or more. One, that it was wrong to fire James Comey, and there was criticism of Rod Rosenstein for recommending that. This IG report absolutely confirms everything he said about Rod Rosenstein's bad decision-making, failure to adhere to policy, his usurpation of authority, and the like. We've also been told a lot of news about how you're not allowed to criticize the FBI, that they are beyond reproach. And I'm sorry, but this report shows that they are not beyond reproach, and that criticizing the FBI and being and caring about what they're doing is something that the media should be doing more of, not less.
Biggest enemy, all right, bigger than Kim Jong-un, bigger than Vladimir Putin?
No, and he, the president, uses the term fake news, as you said, Howie, to go after media organizations who report stories he doesn't like. There is a problem with fake news that's fake. That's not what he's talking about. And to link the North Korea summit and his flowery talk about how great Kim Jong-un is with calling the American press the greatest enemy in our country, I think that should disturb everyone on the right, on the left, in the center. It may be loose talk on Twitter, but it has consequences. We've seen threats against
I want to get
reporters.
Sarah in. I see a distinction
about.
between fake news and biggest enemy. Your thoughts?
I mean, absolutely. There's a very big distinction between fake news and biggest enemy. I think you just have to look at this as part of Trump's playbook. He knows that pinning the media as part of the establishment helps drive that populist movement that got him elected. And so it's a tactic that he's going to use time and time again. If he can diminish the fake news mainstream media, then he can get the American people on his side. And that's just part of the way he operates.
And it's been a fairly successful tactic for him. Let me get a break here. When we come back, the media coverage of the much-awaited North Korea summit's been strikingly negative. How much of that is personal? And later, Rob Reiner and why he's slamming the media, especially Fox, for their coverage of President Trump. There is absolutely no question that Kim Jong-un is a brutal ruler, and President Trump's detractors in the media were quick to challenge the praise he heaped on the dictator.
I learned he's a very talented man. I also learned that he loves his country very much.
He's got a very good personality. He's funny, and he's very, very smart. He's a great negotiator. Really, he's got a great personality. He's a, funny guy. He's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. He loves his people.
Several journalists pressing the president about dealing with such a murderous tyrant, including Bret Baier.
You call people sometimes killers. He is a killer. I mean, he's clearly executing people.
He's a tough guy.
But he's still done some really bad things.
Yeah, but so have a lot of other people done some really bad things.
Molly, many pundits, especially on the left, seem upset or outraged that President Trump would even meet with this guy, given his human rights record.
Yeah, it is upsetting to hear someone who's so bad be praised by the president, and that is something that is very worthy of coverage.
Who knew he was so funny?
But it is it's worth keeping it all in context, too. So we had a president who was absolutely bashing Kim a year ago when he was in Seoul, gave that speech that really took him down a notch. Flattery is a component of diplomacy. It's also a component when dealing with something as important as nuclear disarmament. And I think the president thinks that it is more important to have nuclear disarmament, even if that requires some flattery of a dictator, than to make this the time when you talk about human rights violations.
And on that point, Marie, I mean, you worked in the Obama administration. The press was largely supportive when President Obama met with Raul Castro and normalized relations with Cuba, major human rights violators. So this kind of screams double standard.
Well, what's been interesting is Republican leading commentators in the press were very critical of our administration for not, for example, raising human rights with the Iranians during the Iran nuclear negotiations. Some of those same commentators now are not saying much of anything about Donald Trump.
Sounds like you're saying there's hypocrisy on both sides.
Isn't
depending
that
on,
shocking,
but
Howie?
it's also on your side.
Well, what's interesting is I think that Donald Trump's language, Molly's right, his language was so extreme, little rocket man, fire and fury. It's gone from one extreme to the other. Flattery can be part of diplomacy, but it was so striking, especially coming out of the G7 with our allies, where the president was so critical of someone like Justin Trudeau.
Well, Justin
and
Trudeau.
then very nice to Kim Jong-un.
But Sarah, aren't there lots of legitimate criticisms being made by the press, such as this joint statement was kind of vague, didn't include anything about verification or inspections or deadlines, all to be negotiated. President didn't get much in return for suspending military exercise with South Korea. Those are not anti-Trump. I mean, those are the questions that journalists should ask.
They're completely valid questions. And Molly makes a good point that sometimes flattery can be good for diplomacy. I think the questions that journalists are asking is, where's the diplomacy? If you take a look at the way that
having a summit meeting with a leader that no other American president has ever talked to, that's diplomatic.
It is diplomatic, but if you take a look at the agreement that's coming out of it, the statement that's coming out of it, some parts can be a little bit confusing. I mean, it says that they're going to denuclearize at the same rate that the United States is denuclearizing. I mean, that was not the point of this. It was to get North Korea to denuclearize. So there's a little bit of confusion.
Even the president said it was a first step, and we will have to see what happens. But, some of this criticism comes from the right, Molly. Blogger Eric Erickson wrote that Trump antagonized the G7 and then made kissy face with a man who routinely murders his own people. Had Barack Obama done that, says Erickson, the Republicans would be demanding his impeachment.
And there is truth to that. And I think that one of the things that's interesting that's happening on the right is a separation between a sort of more militaristic, neoconservative, interventionist type and people who seem to be tired of that type of approach to foreign policy. You did see a lot of the same people who criticized Barack Obama meeting with Castro criticizing the way that Trump was with Kim. But there's this other stream that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the media, which is a more realist approach to foreign policy that does seek to have a different approach. I just want to say one thing about the media's criticism of the praise of Kim is it would be much easier to believe that they were genuine about this if they hadn't spent that entire Olympics praising the sister of Kim and talking about how sassy she was. And I think that people have a hard time believing or taking them seriously when they were doing that and then a few months later criticizing Trump.
Well, we're sure on top of, but Marie, some of the criticism of the president is just personal, like Trump was incoherent, Trump was naive, Trump was hoodwinked, says New York Times' Nick Kristof. And it just reminds me of how visceral some of the coverage is about this president.
Well, we have to separate out commentators, right? Nick Kristof is an opinion commentator.
Right.
And I think the media needs to be careful when they are criticizing diplomacy, because you can criticize the statement for being vague, short on specifics. I think we need to be careful not to get into personal attacks, but Donald Trump makes so much of his attacks and his commentary about everything very personal. So we're living in this age now where his language feels so personal. We in the media need to make sure we are staying focused on substance.
But if that's the case, Sarah.
And personality does matter too in diplomacy,
Okay,
Howard.
but if that's the case, do the media fall into the trap of using extreme terms to match what they see as the president's harsh rhetoric?
I mean, sometimes they might, and that's part of the problem here. We need to make sure that, as Marie was saying, as part of the media, you can distill the two. But I think at the end of the day, we did see a lot of personal attacks on the way that the president was handling this diplomacy from the media.
Right. All right. One more thing that just sort of drove me crazy, and we're going to play the soundbite in which the president had a light moment in which he was talking about Kim Jong-un. Let's roll it.
I mean, he's the strong head. Don't let anyone think anything different.
Right.
He speaks and his people sit up at attention. I want my people to do the same.
Okay, that was a joke, and yet it became the lead anecdote in the Washington Post, in Politico. The president has it gets no room for humor. You can say, well, he was serious. He was not serious. I've seen him for a long time. I mean, he says a lot of controversial things. You don't have to pick out the jokes. Marie Harf, Sarah Fisher, Molly Hemingway, thanks very much. A little editorial there at the end. Ahead, the media have a new 4-letter word for Donald Trump's Republican Party. Many are calling it a cult. Really? But up next, a bidding war shaping up for Fox's entertainment properties and an unfair media attack on Kimberly Guilfoyle. What began in the gossip columns has now been confirmed. Kimberly Guilfoyle, co-host of The Five, is dating Donald Trump Jr. The Daily Mail has run pictures of the couple with a friend of the president's son, who's been separated from his wife for more than 9 months, saying they haven't hidden the relationship. Now, Kimberly is a commentator, a longtime friend of the Trump family, a vocal supporter of the president, who's free to date whoever she wants. It might have been better in retrospect if she had mentioned the relationship on the air, but she plans to disclose it if there's any specific discussion involving Donald Jr. What is absurd is for New York Daily News columnist Linda Stassi, in a mean-spirited piece that erroneously describes Guilfoyle as a reporter, to demand she be fired. Stassi sort of apologized for writing that Guilfoyle would be better off picking grapes, saying she didn't know Kimberly is part Puerto Rican. Donald Trump Jr. questioned why Daily News editors approved the piece, tweeting, "I guess hypocrisy, sexism, and racist rhetoric are alive and well there." And even his estranged wife, Vanessa, tweeted the lengths people will go to attack a woman simply because she's dating Don. The era of mega mergers is now upon us. The deal that Disney had to buy the entertainment properties of 21st Century Fox is now being challenged by Comcast, which owns NBC, and has made an all-cash bid that's 19% higher than the Disney offer. This was the immediate outcome of a federal judge approving, despite President Trump's personal opposition, AT&T's $85 billion takeover of Time Warner, whose networks include HBO and CNN. And maybe it's just a coincidence that word leaked to Vanity Fair that CNN President Jeff Zucker has a contract that runs through 2020. But even if AT&T leaves CNN alone, a company that controls the pipes that carry television and the web, as does Comcast, is getting deeper into controlling content, which could mean higher prices and fewer voices for consumers. Ahead on Media Buzz, I ask actor and director Rob Reiner why when it comes to President Trump. He's throwing around words like treason. But first, Robert De Niro drops the F-bomb on Trump, and the press starts using the C word against the president, saying he's leading a cult. The media have a new eye-catching term for the Republican Party under Donald Trump.
Why don't we just start to say it has devolved into a cult? Primary voters in the Republican Party have devolved into a Trumpist cult.
The Republican Party becoming more like a cult than a political party. Boy, that's hard news for the Republicans. You're in a cult. This is Jonestown.
Donald Trump is accused of leading a cult, but you're forced to go along with the whims of Trump to believe that something like CNN is more of a threat than North Korea.
Yeah. Now, someone pegging the word to retiring Senator Bob Corker, who said this to reporters.
It's almost, it's becoming a cultish thing, isn't it? It's not a good place for any party to end up with a cult-like situation.
Except that some pundits were using the word well before that. Joining us now, Emily Jasinski, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner and New York. Kathy Aru, publisher of Catalina Magazine and a former Washington Post magazine editor. Emily, this is the new 4-letter C word. Many in the media adopting this label that the Republican Party is, in fact, some kind of Trumpian cult. What does that tell you about the journalistic mindset?
Well, I think there's some glee that Bob Corker gave them the language, that this language is out there and it exists. And I think that there is a need for some perspective, and that do I believe there's a little bit too much deference to the president? Absolutely. But a lot of this started with the Mark Sanford results in the election. He got 46% of the vote in a state that President Trump is pretty popular in a Republican primary. So I think it's too early to say that there's some sort of cult around Donald Trump. I think it's short-sighted. And so I think it's interesting that the media is so excited to latch onto this.
And Kathy, the Washington Post op-ed page uses it today. But even well before Corker, I did a little Google search. New York Times editorial last week, the cult of Trump. Axios in February, the cult of Trump. National Journal last year, Trump's cult overwhelms the GOP. Your thoughts on that word?
Yeah, I guess so. It's hard with the chicken and the egg here. So I guess the press did it first. But the GOP has jumped on it, so now everyone's kind of owning this word. And Trump does have followers as if it were a cult. But journalist, right-leaning journalist George Will was talking to Bill Maher about this, and he was describing it as maybe not so much of a cult as a culture of fear. So it's interesting that now journalists have taken the word cult, and now they're dissecting it and analyzing it and take it to the next level.
Right.
Is it really a cult? Now what is it? So we might have a brand new word. We're moving away from the C word and moving to another word. So I think journalists are taking it to the next level.
Yeah, you know, Emily, I don't have any problem with the underlying analysis that most in the GOP now blindly follow this president either because they agree with him or because they fear him or fear losing their jobs or they flip-flopped on certain, you know, hot-button issues. But when you think about this word cult, I mean, it suggests, you know, it's spooky.
Yes.
It's a cult of people who are in it must be mindless and delusional. And yet the media perfectly comfortable in using this in relation to Trump.
That's exactly right. It's what it implies about the Republicans. And what's so interesting about this is a president who's actually really popular with Republican voters, and they have to answer, the politicians in this alleged cult have to answer to Republican voters. So just logically, of course, again, I think there's too much deference sometimes, but it makes sense. And to keep that in perspective is I think the media is more excited to use this pejoratively towards Republican politicians than to actually look at what's going on.
Okay, I just think, you know, turning to black magic is not a good look. So let me play this for you, Kathy. I want to talk about the fallout for Robert De Niro last weekend saying this at the Tony Awards.
I'm going to say one thing. Trump.
So it's almost like he's a caricature of a Hollywood liberal. He just comes out with this crude thing to say, no sophisticated analysis. Is this because the award shows have become such routine forums for Trump bashing that you have to be more and more profane in order to just get some attention?
Well, he used to be known, De Niro was so quiet, they used to call him shy. He was not like this before. And it seems like with the Trump administration, with this new presidency, he has really come out of his shell. And this was the latest.
Wait, I'm going to stop you right there. Stop right there. Right. This actor, renowned actor, goes on national television and uses the F word against the President of the United States, and you're saying, oh, he's come out of his shell?
Well, I actually read some journalists, some media has said that this is him coming out of his shell. I think cussing on TV like that is a little extreme. But then the president writes and says that I think he said he was it dumb or he used some harsh words.
Let me tell you what he said. The president tweeted that De Niro was a very low IQ individual.
Low IQ.
Who's received too many shots to the head by real boxers in movies. So let me turn to you, Emily.
Punchy.
Punchy, yeah. CBS bleeped the word, but everyone knew what he was saying, and everybody could hear it online. And what I found equally disturbing was that he gets a standing ovation.
Well, so I didn't bat an eyelash when I saw the headline. I thought, of course, this is what our award shows now. It's Hollywood exhibiting their outrage about Trump, and they're just trying to literally Trump each other with every different award show. But when I read that there was a standing ovation in Radio City Music Hall, I was actually really surprised that they were able to muster that amount of enthusiasm, knowing what this is going to look like to the rest of the country.
All right, let me get to this other incident in the White House press room. Of course, there's been a big debate about immigration and separating children from families, and the press has been up in arms about that. So Brian Karem in the White House press room just interrupts. He's not even called on, delivers this rant to Sarah Sanders. He is a local newspaper editor, Playboy columnist, and CNN contributor. Take a look.
Don't you have any empathy for what these people are going through? They have less than you do.
Guys,
Sarah, come on,
settle down.
Seriously.
I'm trying to be serious, but I'm not going to have you yell out of turn. Chill. Hey, Brian, I know you want to get some more TV time.
These people have nothing. They come to the border with nothing, and you throw children in cages. You're a parent. You're a parent of young children. Don't you have any empathy for what they go through?
So CNN Emily later put its contributor on the air and said, boy, you were passionate about that.
Passionate. What a contrived and boring performance. You know, he wanted the attention more than he wanted the answer. And while I think Sarah Sanders talks about her kids a lot, and sometimes in political context, so I think the question at heart of what he was trying to do is fair. But this was performative, it was theater, and it was much less interested in substance than in attention for Brian Karem.
And Kathy, you know, Brian Karem later said, well, I was hearing BS, and I'm only human, to explain this outburst. If you want to be an advocate on this issue, be my guest. But if you're going to be in the press room as an accredited journalist, how about asking a question, a real question?
Right, and I completely agree. I've been in that room. I am a Latina. I get heated about issues, and when you're a journalist, I mean, rule number one of journalism is don't put yourself into the story. You're there to collect facts and then give the facts to your audience, your reader, your viewer. So he broke every rule of journalism by making it about himself, making it personal about the press secretary. Sanders was very professional, so he did not respect that room. She did.
All right, a rare moment of agreement. Kathy Aru, Evelyn Jashinsky. Thanks for a great conversation. Coming up, I go toe-to-toe with Rob Reiner on his harsh Hollywood rhetoric against President Trump and his unhappiness with the media, and that includes Fox. Rob Reiner is an unabashed Hollywood liberal, an actor and activist who's used very harsh rhetoric about Donald Trump and has assailed the coverage of the president. We sat down here in Washington to talk about that and the new film he directs and stars in, Shock and Awe, about the media's failures, except for one news outlet, in the buildup to the Iraq War. Rob Reiner, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You're a fierce critic of President Trump. You hosted a fundraiser for Hillary. I get it. But Robert De Niro goes on the Tony Award stage and says, F Trump, gets a standing ovation. Can you see how that would be offensive to the 45% of the country that supports this president?
Well, yes, and I can also see how it could be offensive to some of the people who don't support the president. Listen, everybody's entitled to, free speech. They can say whatever they want, but I don't think that is particularly helpful for those of us who don't want to see Trump in office and don't want to see him to continue to be in office.
Let me ask you about some of your own words. You tweeted the other day, when an American president attacks our closest allies and embraces a hostile enemy power, you say he's in a conspiracy to commit treason. Now, so because you disagree with Trump's foreign policy, which you have every right to do.
Yeah, I don't.
Treason?
I don't say he is. I said one can only conclude. And there's a big difference.
That's a fine distinction.
It is a fine distinction, but I don't know whether or not he committed treason. That will be something that we either discover or don't discover as as Mueller's investigation. Because unfortunately, the House and Senate investigations are not moving along. So we'll have to see what happens.
So you don't see that as an overly inflammatory word to use about a president?
It is a very inflammatory word, but if it turns out to be, let's put it this way. Yeah, but let's put it this way. From what I see right now, and there's a lot of blanks that need to be filled in for sure.
After the election, you called the outcome the greatest attack on this democracy since 1941. I was kind of stunned by that because you're comparing the lawful election of a candidate who won the Electoral College to the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. Now that you're older and wiser, was that going a little too far? Maybe you were feeling overwrought at the time?
No, actually, I feel a little bit more. I think I not only agree with that, but I would go even further because we're not talking about when we start looking at what happened to America. People have to really understand this, and this is one of the most difficult parts of understanding the Russian.
Rob, we had an election.
No, I understand that.
You're comparing it to more than 2,000 Americans being killed at Pearl Harbor.
I'm not talking about the election that we have and electing Donald Trump. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about, and it's really important to understand this because this is the key to us here. We're talking about a foreign enemy power influencing an election. In the world of cyber warfare, it is insidious, and we don't necessarily feel it. We do know the capacity. We have learning the capacity, not just from a disinformation campaign or active measures, which the Soviets and the Russians now have been doing it forever.
So just to clarify, your comments are aimed more at Russia and the meddling, and the undeniable meddling in the election.
Yes.
All right, I'm glad we clarified that.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the press for a moment. You recently lumped in Fox News with Alex Jones and some others in what you call state-run media.
Right, I said essentially state-run.
All right, essentially state-run media that backs up the president. I presume you know that Fox has a thriving news division with Chris Wallace and Brett Baer and Shepard Smith and a whole bunch of reporters.
Right.
So I think your label was too broad.
Well, I do always, and I also tweeted out about Shepard Smith. And by the way, I've met Shepard Smith. He's a great guy, and he is reporting the news. There's no question about it. He is telling the truth, and so is Chris Wallace. And I haven't seen as much of Brett Baer, but I believe he probably is too.
So you disagree
I do know there's a difference between news reporting and opinion and editorial and all of that. But what I'm saying is the editorial part of Fox News, which is, you know, Hannity and Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham.
Shows,
those shows are not just, they're really in support of Trump. And that is, Fox News has a good rating. It has a very strong rating. So there is a chunk of media that is verbally and overtly in support of Donald Trump. That's just true.
Well, there was a chunk of media that was overtly in support of Barack Obama, including places like MSNBC. But let's turn to the press conduct in the run-up to the Iraq War, which is a subject of shock and awe. It's a period I covered intensively.
Right.
You're playing John Walcott. He was the Washington bureau chief of Knight Ridder newspapers, which is now McClatchy, an old colleague of mine. In terms of name ID, would you concede that Tom Hanks had an easier time paying Red Bradley than you playing John Walcott?
Well, here's the funny thing about that. I wasn't supposed to play that part. Alec Baldwin was set to play that part, and we had been shooting for a week with Woody Harrelson and Tommy Lee Jones. And on the Saturday before he was supposed to shoot on Monday, he calls and said he's not doing it. He dropped out. I'm saying, oh my God, what do I do? So my wife, Michelle, who's one of the producers with me, she suggested I play the part. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know. I don't like directing and acting. And then I realized I'm playing, I said, I'm available, so I'll do it. And then she says to me, the one bit of direction I got, because I'm playing John Walcott, she said, try to be less Jewish. And I thought, I don't know. I'm from the Bronx. I'll see what I can do.
All right. Well, that was a work in progress. More of my conversation with Rob Reiner in a moment as we debate the media's sorry record during the run-up to the Iraq War. More now with Rob Reiner as we turn to his new film about the press, the Bush administration, and Iraq. So you say the media weren't tough enough in the run-up to the Iraq War. They were not just not tough enough, they were non-existent.
Right.
Now, there were some exceptions. There were stories of the Washington Post that were skeptical, but tended to get buried on page A17.
Right.
In one scene, you playing Walcott called the Philadelphia Inquirer, a Knight Ridder newspaper at the time, and you complain they're not running your stories.
Right, and that was the case.
And what was behind that?
Well, that actually happened. I mean, Knight Ridder News Service would supply to a number of newspapers around the country, and we talk about it in the film that they were represented by a lot of military bases that got there, and there's a speech that my character gives in the film that he says,
"We don't write for people who send other people's kids to war. We write for people whose kids get sent to war."
And so we were concerned that the Knight Ridder stories were not getting out, and many of the Knight Ridder papers did not print.
Were they not getting out because
they didn't print them?
Yeah, but even in the broader media, were they not getting a lot of pickup because of the mindset in the mainstream media at the time? I mean, Bob Woodward told me after the war that he was part of the groupthink, because obviously the Bush administration sold this war very hard.
Right. The two reasons. One is that we were swept up in patriotism, 9/11, and people just went with, like you say, the groupthink. The other thing was the Bush administration, in a smart way, and from their standpoint, they never responded to these articles. They gave them no oxygen. They didn't refute them. They didn't talk about them. So it never got any attention.
The underlying assumption, and it was more than an assumption in the film, was that the Bush administration was lying about Iraq.
Right.
But that, as opposed to cherry-picking intelligence, as opposed to not being skeptical enough about the intelligence, but even John Walcott says in an interview that to this day he doesn't know that people were lying. That seems like a bit of a stretch on your part.
Well, we're saying that Cheney lied. We say Cheney lied at this one thing about the idea in general, because he talked about a connection between Mohammed Atta and Iraqi intelligence, which didn't exist. He talked about they were on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon. They talked about aluminum tubes.
My point is,
that could be used
saying things that turn out to be untrue, however terrible that is not necessarily the same as lying, deliberately peddling falsehoods.
Yes, that's true. But if you do know that you've already made an assumption that you want to go to war, and that you are crafting bits and pieces of intelligence in order to make that case, and ignoring the vast amount of intelligence that says we're not sure about this. We don't have good intelligence because we hadn't been inside Iraq with weapons inspectors for 4 years. I would argue that you're lying.
And at the same time, this president has gotten overwhelmingly negative coverage. He did during the campaign. Everybody acknowledges that. Shouldn't fairness be also a part of a message for fair and independent press?
He got a lot of negative coverage. There's no question about it. But I don't think during the primary season and even during the general, he got the kind of there's one thing to say negative coverage and there's one thing to say due diligence and scrutiny, real scrutiny. I don't think he got that.
You recently had a very civil debate with Anthony Scaramucci. Are you and the Mooch going to do some kind of Odd Couple show?
Oh, God. Oh, my God. You know, it's funny. I didn't even know because I was going to go on the Ari Melber show, you know. And they said, well, Scaramucci, I didn't know he was going to be there. But are we going to do a show? You mean like, Crossfire, you know?
Yeah.
You know, Anthony, you ignorant slut. You know, I know, or whatever. You know, we're going to do that? No, I don't think so.
I think you're giving it a thumbs down.
Yeah, probably not.
Rob Reiner, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Shock and Awe hits theaters next month and is available now on DirecTV. Well, that's it for this edition of Media Buzz. I'm Howard Kurtz. Happy Father's Day to all you dads out there. Have a great day. I'm going to hang out with my girls later. We hope you'll like our Facebook page. Check it out. Give us a like. We post my daily columns and original videos there. And I'm sure you'll let me know what you think on Twitter at Howard Kurtz about any aspect of the show or the coverage of what's in the news. You can also DVR the program if you're out doing something else on Sunday morning. We still like to get you to check it out. We will be back here next Sunday, as we are every Sunday. 11 Eastern is the time. See you then with the latest buzz.